Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assembly workshop. This one is on an issue which I know has been vexing for a number of organisers and practitioners. The question of how best to select and present knowledge. We have to admit that the climate issues around climate are incredibly complex and at times contested in terms of what solutions we should be thinking about. And it's a really important element of, well, absolutely crucial element of climate assemblies that members of assemblies are given balanced information. But beyond that question of balanced information, how you do that, who's responsible for selecting, what kind of principles they use, and then indeed how evidence is best presented in order that people with different educational abilities and different cultural backgrounds are able to understand and engage with that evidence, I think are still really pertinent and open questions. So I'm really delighted that my colleague Malte Ibsen from the Danish Board of Technology was willing to take on a project where we started raising these questions and trying to provide some guidance on how to best curate knowledge within assemblies. And Malte is in the process of building some guidance, and this workshop is part of the process of him presenting some of his early findings, but also getting an opportunity to learn from the broader Knoca community about some of the lessons that they've learned from their own practice or ideas that they've got that could be put in process. So this is a workshop that I have almost nothing to do with. It's my favorite kind of workshop. So I'm going to pass over to Malte, thank him for the work he's done to date, and he's going to lead us through today's event. So over to you, Malte.
Thanks so much, Graham. Thank you for that. And thank you all for being here. I'll just share my screen now. I have some slides prepared. There it is. Yeah, so welcome to this workshop from me as well, on evidence or knowledge curation. I quite like that expression, even if it's maybe a bit less precise. It's a bit more artsy. So the purpose of the workshop basically is, so the purpose of the whole workshop and all the elements in it, as I've conceived it, is to share experiences and reflections on selecting and presenting evidence amongst members of the Knoca network. So basically, it's an exercise that's about kind of getting smarter together, using collective intelligence and experience to basically see if we can clarify best practices and also reflections on what doesn't work so well in knowledge curation in climate assemblies. And so a secondary purpose then is to present the main conclusions of a draft Knoca briefing on evidence that I'm working on at the moment. So that's going to be the kind of that's going to be the start, the platform that we'll build on, and then afterwards we'll hear two voices from the field share their experiences and reflections on knowledge curation in climate assemblies, and then just a little bit on my own sort of interests. So what I really hope to kind of gather from this workshop for my own work. So that is first to hear your reactions to the main conclusions of the briefing. That's of course the one of my hopes for this workshop. But another one is also really, and I'd like to emphasize this, to draw on your experiences, to draw on the experiences and reflections of all the people in this network who've worked on these things and are presently working on them, and to possibly integrate these reflections and experiences into the further work on this briefing and ultimately the guidance that Knoca will produce on curating evidence or selecting and presenting evidence in climate assemblies. So that's the purpose. And so the agenda for today is I'll start with the presentation now, which I've already begun, and then we'll hear from Ines. I'll present our speakers in a moment. Then we'll hear from Ines, who will speak for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And then we'll hear from Lars. And then afterwards, we'll have a very short break. No, we'll have a discussion. So we'll have a short kind of Q&A, 15 minutes, with your reactions to the presentations and your kind of immediate thoughts. And then afterwards, I'd like to continue, or ask you to continue the kind of experience sharing, reflection sharing exercise in breakout rooms. So my intention or my thought is basically to continue the whole kind of, you'll hear what I have gathered in my work on the briefing, what I found out from interviewing people and looking at the literature. Then we'll hear from Ines, we'll hear from Lars, and then in the breakout rooms, I'd like to hear from you as much as possible, or we'd like to hear from you and hear from each other, learn from each other. And then finally, we'll have a quick kind of recap of what was talked about in the breakout rooms before ending at 4. So that's the plan. And just to quickly present the speakers today. So I will be the first one. I work here at the Danish Board of Technology. And the presentation I'll give is the main conclusions from this draft Knoca briefing on evidence that I've been working on for the last few months. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And then afterwards, we'll hear from Ines Oman, who has her own company called the Sustainable Quality of Life Research and Facilitation. And Ines was a very central figure in the Austrian Climate Assembly, the Klimarat. And she'll tell us a little bit about her experiences and reflections on knowledge curation in the Klimarat. And then after Ines, we'll hear from Lars, my colleague here at the Danish Board of Technology, former director and now senior advisor, who will tell us a bit about his experiences and reflections on knowledge curation in the Danish Borgerting på klimaområdet, as it's officially called, the Danish Climate Assembly. So those are the presenters that you'll hear from here in the first hour. Okay, so the background for the evidence briefing, the Knoca evidence briefing I've been working on, is that we have more and more climate assemblies, but there's a lack of guidance. So this is the concern from Knoca. There's a lack of guidance on how to select, organize, and present evidence in climate assemblies. And of course, this is the whole purpose of Knoca, is to, as I said before, kind of get smarter together, learn from each other, clarify best practices, and produce guidance that can be used in future climate assemblies. And this briefing is then part of the Knoca guidance work on evidence. It's a kind of preparatory work for the guidance document. And the purpose in the briefing is really to learn from the existing literature, firstly in deliberative democratic theory, so at a more kind of theoretical level, but then also on more empirical literature or studies on selection and presentation of evidence in mini-publics more generally, so not just climate assemblies. So what can be learned from the existing kind of body of literature that looks into these questions. And then finally, it is also to look at recent trends in climate science communication or science communication in general, to see if there's anything we can learn from that literature in terms of presenting evidence in climate assemblies. That's kind of the first part of the briefing. And then the second part of the briefing is to learn from practice. And to try and do that, I've conducted interviews with 2 people as a rule, both practitioners and knowledge committee members from 5 climate assemblies in the UK, in France, in Denmark, in Germany, and in Austria. And I've also looked at reports and evaluations and observations, various observer reports, to try and learn from the existing practice. So that's the background. And I'll basically just start going through the main conclusions now. So this is the first slide of the main conclusions. And the first thing I found is that multiple studies have found that the evidence in the evidence provision stage, or the information provision stage, or knowledge provision stage, is really of paramount importance in the formation of attitudes of participants in mini-publics. So of course, this is hardly surprising. This is the stage where they're presented with knowledge, however way that stage is kind of handled and organized. But a lot of studies on mini-publics have found that this stage is really very important, and often the most important phase in the formation of attitudes. And this importance, I think, raises a number of epistemic and normative and practical questions, also kind of really philosophical questions, but also very practical questions that knowledge curation and citizen assemblies must take account of. So that's the first kind of obvious finding, if you can call it that, is that this is a really important question to think about. And if you have the intention of organizing a climate assembly, this is an area where it makes sense to really put in some work to think about this, and to think about how to organize knowledge curation and evidence work, because this is extremely important for the outcome that the climate assembly will produce, or the citizens will produce in the end. Okay, so the second part of the main conclusions is that from a kind of deliberative democratic point of view, it's important that expert input must be subject to potential counter-expertise and public scrutiny. So in the sort of Habermas version of this point, this is true of the general public, but I think it's equally true, or we can say that for a lot of people who come from the kind of deliberative democratic perspective, this is equally true of mini-publics and also of climate assemblies, that expert input should not stand alone. It should be open to potential contestation by other experts and the public, that is the participants in the climate assembly. And in the context of a climate assembly, I argue that this ideally requires recruitment of a broad spectrum of experts within the bounds of reasonable disagreement, so leaving out climate skeptics and that kind, and that participants are given the opportunity to influence, if not determine, the selection of evidence and speakers. So this is really important, I think, is that an important concern that from a kind of theoretical point of view, or from a kind of principle point of view, it's important that citizens or participants are also given an opportunity to participate in the knowledge curation work, and or at least contest the evidence that's presented. And there's also a potential dilemma that I think maybe we could discuss later there in the final sentence, about the extent to which participants should ideally be allowed to kind of have their hands on or determine evidence and speakers, the selection of speakers. But in reality, so this is basically what I found from speaking to people who've organized climate assemblies and from looking at the reports, time and budget constraints often mean that evidence and speakers are chosen by organizers and only subsequently vetted by a scientific board. And often citizens are only given the chance to influence knowledge curation much later in the process, if at all. So it's not always the case that citizens are actually given the opportunity to influence the process or the organization of evidence selection and presentation. And of course, we can discuss whether this is a good or a bad thing, but in light of some of the kind of principled views that we find in the deliberative democratic literature, this is at least something to be mindful about. Yeah. So the third point, or the third slide on conclusions, this is a point about how presentation of evidence from different scientific disciplines or different scientific areas, more broadly conceived, may elicit or kind of provoke different reactions or reactive attitudes from citizens. And there are some really interesting studies that have found that participants often react with deference to presentations of natural scientific evidence in particular. So they kind of have a tendency to submit to the kind of authoritative expert opinion when it concerns natural scientific evidence, whereas they tend to react in a more kind of critical and participatory or active and deliberative way to presentation of social scientific evidence. And given that, empirically speaking, speakers in climate assemblies often predominantly come from a natural scientific background, I kind of argue that organizers must be vigilant or take care that natural scientific evidence should be presented in an interactive format as much as possible, which facilitates a kind of deliberative reaction from participants rather than blind deference to or deference to authoritative expert opinion. So this is really a kind of a note of caution that this is there's a tendency for citizens to react to, for example, Earth system science in a particular way, and that it's important to be extra mindful about getting them on board with being able to discuss and deliberate on the evidence and potentially take a critical attitude also towards the evidence that they're presented. And then finally, I also find that climate assemblies often struggle with the scope of climate change as what is sometimes called a wicked problem or a super wicked problem. So basically just, I mean, a humongous issue that is super complex and very difficult to get both your brain and your hands around and kind of act on in any way, because it's so complex, it's multi-causal. There are so many different things at work. We don't have the institutional structure to really take care of it in any effective way or react to or address climate change in any effective way. And it's not a surprise, of course, that climate assemblies often struggle with this gargantuan scope. But it does mean, and this is something to bear in mind, that sessions in climate assemblies are subject to, when they are subject to a sectorial or topical division, when you divide sessions into having a sectorial focus, so for example, agriculture and energy systems and so on, that this often comes at the cost of cross-cutting issues and the overall picture. So this is also something to think about when managing or organizing the selection and presentation of evidence in climate assemblies. So the fourth slide is that is really about the role of experts, scientific experts in climate assemblies. So there are quite a lot of both theoretical but also empirical work, studies that emphasize the importance of experts acting as so-called honest brokers in mini-publics, who can engage with participants in a more kind of interactive way, so through dialogue and joint deliberation, and offer an overview of the different actionable policy options, rather than just kind of a one-way communication of knowledge. But in reality, I found both through interviews and reports that that experts often subscribe, so the experts invited often subscribe to a kind of outmoded knowledge deficit model of science communication. And I will speak a bit about that in a moment, which compromises their ability to serve as honest brokers, because they approach it essentially as a lecture at the university, where students need to learn something and they are there to tell them what's true and what's not true. But this accentuates, this underlines the responsibility of organizers to brief them properly and facilitate their kind of scientific input. So in a sense, this shifts the honest broker function or role from scientific experts to organizers and facilitators, the more this is the case. And so this is the fifth slide, which where I argue or I find that recent trends in science communication emphasize the importance of taking account of how our values affect the understanding and interpretation of climate science communication, as well, of course, and this I think makes a lot of sense, the perceived acceptability of proposed climate policies, technological solutions, and more general sort of value-based approaches to decarbonization. So values, so the kind of literature in science communication has really emphasized that values play a major part in audiences' reception of evidence on climate change. And this has also, this kind of shift or this increased focus on values has also kind of gone hand in hand with an increased focus on narrative formats, storytelling, and visualization as ways to kind of increase understanding of complex problems. So this kind of big wicked problem, these complex societal and natural problems, and to increase, this is important, I think, to increase engagement and participation by citizens from diverse educational and cultural backgrounds. So this, I think, is definitely a trend in recent science communication literature. And this is basically, so my argument in the briefing is that this might be the point at which there is the greatest unutilized potential for climate assemblies to kind of to learn something from the literature and from broader experiences with science communication, and to make much greater use of sort of narrative formats, storytelling, and visualization, both to try and increase understanding and to provoke a deliberative attitude from participants. So when you have these dry, natural scientific facts, ideally you want to present them in a way that provokes as much kind of room for discussion and intention to discuss from participants as possible. And I think this is where the literature argues that narrative format, storytelling, and visualization can really play this role. And also to maintain the engagement of participants with a kind of diverse educational and cultural background. Okay, so I'm running a little bit behind schedule, but that was also my final slide. So 3 minutes late. I think that is manageable. But that's basically what I had to say. That it was a bit quick, but I hope you were able to follow the main points from the briefing that I've been working on. And now, basically, I'd like to give the word to Ines. I think somebody has it. Oh yeah, it's solved. I'd like to give the word to Ines to give us a kind of perspective from the field, as I said in the beginning, from the Austrian Climate Assembly, the Klimarat. And Ines has, of course, been with us before here. So most of you know Ines. And I'm very grateful that Ines took time to just give us a brief kind of, to tell a story about her experiences and on knowledge curation.
Thank you. Thank you, Maite. Thank you, Knoca team, for letting me talk again about this, not again about this topic. I've talked about something else already in a webinar. And I'm aware that I can only give my perception of this knowledge curation in the Austrian Climate Assembly, in the Klimarat. And there are others, I'm sure. And Maite spoke with a colleague of mine who was very much involved in the science communication between the scientists and our moderating team. So it's my view, and I'm sure there are others. And I have just seen that a colleague of mine who was the moderator during the Klimarat is here as well. I'm not sure if she wants to say something, but I invite you to say something after I talk, to maybe amend my thoughts. Okay, I have prepared a couple of slides, only 3, if I may show them. So, no, do you see the starting slide? Yeah, it's just some insights on the evidence creation from the Austrian Climate Assembly. We had a scientific advisory board that was quite important and grew more and more important during the process. I'll tell you in a second why. There were some, the Ministry for Climate Action was the institution who called for the Climate Assembly and who organized it. And they had some requirements for this scientific advisory board. First, it has to be really interdisciplinary, and all relevant disciplines connected to climate change or climate protection should be included. A good balance between junior and senior scientists. A gender balance was very important, and also a balance between universities, but also research institutes that are more applied, or even think tanks who have a little bit of a political twist. We had one more neoliberal, because the scientists mainly and universities had, I would say, what are pro-climate protection background. I was maybe my role in a nutshell. I was coordinating the whole assembly for the Ministry for Climate Action, more on this meta level, trying to hold all together and to structure the whole thing. So it was also my role to set up this scientific advisory board half a year before we started with the Climate Assembly, and I could win and recruit 2 coordinators who were my dream team, to be honest. It was one elderly, already retired professor, climate scientists and glacier scientists, IPCC main lead author, and then a younger colleague, she's an environmental economist, being a professor in the University of Graz. And these 2 together with me built up the team. In the end, we had 15 people. And during the process, we realized we would need further expertise, for instance, in particular for carbon tax or for some social impacts of climate policy. Then we enlarged the team during the process. It was not the case, and this was a disadvantage, I would say, that the citizens could choose them or could vet them and say we want him or not her. However, there was no criticism at all, at least not to my knowledge, from the citizens, either because they were really happy with the board or because they, are not used to criticize scientists. There is still this, wow, the scientists up there in the ivory tower picture in Austria, and there is a very, very strong science skepticism, which we saw during the pandemic, where we had extremely large demonstrations against all the pandemic rules and vaccination and so on. It was really, really brutal, partly, and the skepticism. I think Austria is among the second highest skepticism for science in Europe. So don't know why. It has a history. I have some ideas, but I'm not going deeper in this here. What was the role of the scientific board? Mainly, first, we thought to give inputs, to give their talks, to prepare slides, to help preparing material. In a second, I'll let you know what material we had. They were asked not to give any recommendations for our policy measures they would think as suitable and very important. All they could give within the topics that were selected, that we had 5 main topics, were selected by the core team, the moderators and the scientific board, together with the citizens. Within these 5 topics, they gave so kind of useful leverage points. For instance, when you look at land use and agriculture, then it was one leverage point is the reduction of animal protein. Or of course, in mobility, one leverage point was reduction of transport in general, things like this, but they did not recommend any measures per se. Then it started that they, during the process, they got more and more interest in the Climate Assembly, and also the citizens used them more and more as resource persons. So instead of being there once, many of them were there 3 or 4 out of the 6 weekends. They gave their private phone numbers. They could be called by the moderators, but also by the citizens between the meetings. And they were part of the team quite quickly and not something coming from outside. So they were really inherent in the whole team, I would say. And what we also did with the scientific board, I was part of it we called it the long night of evaluation. Between the beginning of the 5th weekend out of 6, we evaluated the recommendations they've produced so far due to their impact on greenhouse gases, but also social impacts and economic impacts. So this was not planned in the beginning, but was done. We've done it. So now about the selection and the presenting of the evidence. Yeah, I told you already these topics were chosen. I mean, of course, the topics were based on in which areas in Austria do we have the highest greenhouse gas emissions, which were used in other national climate assemblies, and the scientists gave their input as well. And we had 5 topics, and we asked during the first weekend the citizens whether they want to add something, and they did add issues such as health, for instance, or very important was the social impacts for them, or also education. So, does this go on? And for each topic, the following was prepared: an information brief between 4 and 8 pages in a non-scientific language, and not developed by the scientists. It was done for the first time, but this was not appreciated that much because it was too scientific, that language. So we had a science communicator, a lady called Hannah, who prepared these briefs and then together with the scientists finalized them and made clear that this was evidence-based numbers and information that was given there. So it had to be approved. This was sent to all the citizens before each weekend when the topics were discussed. Then there was an input of a presentation, 10 to 20 minutes with slides. And after the first weekend, we realized, wow, they have to train our scientists. They are not at universities here. And we had rehearsals with them together with some moderators who gave feedback. It's understandable, it's too much, it's too quick, blah, blah, blah. So that they had overworked their slides and their inputs, which was maybe a bit annoying for them in the beginning, but they understood really why it was important to adapt their inputs because the audience was maybe a different one as they were used to. And then we had of each talk a video and all this information and links to further sources is still publicly available on the website. It was just different that the citizens got the information before the weekend when it was presented, and the wider public, everybody could look at it afterwards, and it's still on there. And I would say a learning processes took place for everybody. Of course, our citizens learned a lot. They gained a lot of knowledge or insights. But there was also some social learning taking place by people understood the perception of others because their backgrounds were different, because they worried about other things. They had different values. And there was even some change of values happening. This is what social learning is. I understand the position of others and first accept it. I'm not against it anymore. And maybe my position changes as well. So this really happened, I would say, not only within or among the citizens, maybe even for the moderators. And there was learning processes for the scientists, of course, how they can or could talk to the citizens and being understood and raising interest for their topic. So they gained quite a lot and saw that what they do is not only for, I don't know, some other scientists and to get impact points for publications, but to really change something in this world for the better. And here's some special Austrian features. There's also some, I would say, disadvantages or negative points. One I mentioned, but there may be more. It was, yeah, we can talk about it later if you have questions. But what was maybe special is this change of roles of the scientists from always in Asterix, from better knowers to friends and learners, and from objective researchers to activists, in the sense of really understanding that they have a normative role, and it's not enough to create new knowledge, but it's also important to bring this knowledge into action. And I think the scientists really took this quite serious. Some of them are really into activism now. Then we could, I think, at least among our citizens, reduce this skepticism towards science. And there is still an ongoing collaboration. The citizens founded an association. They do lobbying that the results are implemented, and they invite for events. They create the scientists and they come, and this all for free. And there was, this was then my role after the first 2 or 3 weekends, the need for conciliating between the moderation team and the scientists, because there were some grown zones. They, of course, had different objectives, different roles. And me, being on the one hand a researcher for more than 20 years and also a facilitator, I could understand both sides. So we decided to meet once a month for a kind of mediation meeting between these two teams. What was maybe special is common preparation of the material, our science communicator, the moderators, and the scientists together. Yeah, that's it from my side for now. And if there are any questions, or I ask Maxi if you want to add something from your point, but only if you want, don't feel obliged, please.
Thank you, Ines. I think there's not much to add. You really gave a good overview. I maybe just want to highlight again that I really like, I think a really important point was that we rehearsed with the scientists beforehand, their presentations, because when I watched their presentations first, I was like, oh my God, none of the citizens will understand it. And then when I saw them actually presenting it again and working our feedback into it, it really was a total different presentation, and the citizens could understand what they were actually talking about Yeah, and I also want to highlight what you said, that the citizens really appreciate, it's my little daughter who you hear there as well, that the citizens really appreciated that the scientists were there a lot of weekends and they could directly interact with them and ask questions. That was really, like I was facilitating in the field of mobility, and the citizens I worked with, they really admired this a lot. So yeah, that's from my side.
Thank you, Maxi. This was very spontaneous. I didn't know she would be here, so great, thank you. There was one question I saw by Pablo, whether the scientific advisory board focused just in evidence delivery or also in other aspects of design and organization. No, we had a super team, about 30 moderators and 10 people in the organization team, but in the design, yes, especially with the moderators within their topics. We had 5 topics, 10 groups, and the mobility researchers were, of course, devoted to the mobility groups, and there they sometimes talk with the moderators when they should give input, when they should be there, how we make it. So yes, it was ad hoc design, but the main design was done by the moderation team.
Thanks so much, Ines, for that insight. I know you have to run soon, so I just want to ask.
I can stay 20 more minutes, so I will listen. Also
okay, excellent. I just want to say, if anyone has any more questions for Ines, then they can post them in the chat maybe. Marie, you wanted to ask a question. We can just.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can put it in the chat or whatever's convenient.
I mean, if it's specifically for Ines, then it makes sense to ask it now, I think.
It is for her. Other people might also have thoughts on this, but I wondered, so the materials that the scientists prepared, we have made a choice to not circulate anything in advance in between the assemblies, just to make sure that everyone comes and is on the same level as citizens, that people with a lot of time are allowed to read a lot, and then people with less time come less prepared. So how much material was made available, and what was like how did you present what you expected from the citizens?
Good point. We had the discussion on this as well. Before the first meeting, nothing. And then they were asked whether they want some information. And most of them said yes. And these were information briefs with a lot of graphics and visualization between 4 and 8 pages. And there were links for further information and literature, some really read papers. They could if they wanted, but nobody had to. And even without having read these 4 to 8 pages, they were integrated because some in the end did not read. Yeah. And some even read more. So, but it was, I think, together with the citizens that it was decided that they get at least this small information brief, but no slides, no nothing more. This was only after the presentation. And of course, it was an interactive one. They could ask questions and were asked for their reflections and so on.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there was one more question in the chat for you, Ines. If you want to take that.
Activist role. Well, you might know this group called Scientists for Future, which is quite active in Austria. And some of the scientists got more active in this group then. For instance, we have this last generation in Austria. This is the people sitting on the street and gluing their hands on the street. And there is this group of Austrian climate researchers who stand behind them. They wouldn't be active and sitting on the street, but be there when they do it. And when there are some journalists going around, answer questions. And some of our people in the scientific board got active there, for instance. And there is a very intense discussion now for the role of climate researchers, honest broker or activists, and there is opinion from too, and this is very much discussed. But we have one university, the BOKU, the University für Bodenkultur, applied life scientists, and there I think this is a very applied, it is called the University of Life Sciences and Applied Life Sciences. There it's kind of normal to be normative there as a researcher and to change something in this world, especially to reduce the climate problems. So I think it's well thought through who is going to be active and not. And I put the activism under these quotation marks because it's not really the activists, but they go to demonstrations. And this is the Scientists for Future group mainly. I'm also part of it, for instance. I think I've used my time. If there is more questions, I can answer them in the chat.
Oh, that would be amazing. Thanks so much, Ines. Thanks again for joining and speaking to us and telling us about your experiences. That was really wonderful. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Lars. Are you there, Lars?
I'm here.
Excellent.
I'm here, and I didn't make a presentation, but I made some points, 10 points I would like to talk over, and I'm just issuing them in the chat so that you can follow them there. Anything you wanted to say, Malte?
No, I'll leave the floor to you, and then just say that I mean, I think we should leave a bit of time for discussion at the end. So
Yeah.
10-15 minutes, something like that would be ideal. Thanks.
Yeah. I have these 10 points. I just want to go through, and by the way, thanks for having the occasion. There's an overlap with Malte said and what Ines said, so I will focus more on those places where we had discussions, I would say, or where we seem to be different. First of all, expert planning panel. We had a lot of problems with our expert planning panel. If I should say something about what worked best, it was we had 2 rounds of citizen assembly, and in the second assembly we had a mixed panel, balanced panel. And I also say what worked best was when we didn't ask them to come up with suggested experts, but we rather tested our program on them. That was where we got most out of them. I think the problems we had was in the first instance, the expert panel was appointed because the ministry, who was the commissioning body, contacted the Association of Scientists in Denmark and that association, Association of Universities, and that association pointed out experts in the different fields. And that wasn't a very engaging way of doing it, so they weren't much engaged, to be honest. They tended to point, when we asked them for expert, they pointed at the scientists sitting in the office next to them, or pointed at their postdocs and PhDs or something like that. It seemed to be a very closed environment we got in that way. In the second round, we insisted on making a balanced panel with stakeholders, and experts and people who had more, I would say, more of an oversight input to things, oversight attitude to things, and I think that worked better, and also to test things on. But generally, both of them didn't work very well. And what I compare that with our experiences, because at the Danish Board of Technology, we have for more than 30 years worked with expert panels, and they have worked very well. And that's why we were quite surprised of why this didn't work well. And my feeling is that it was basically because they were looking at the commissioning body all of the time. They were looking at the ministry. So they were kind of not, they didn't see themselves in the situation as someone who advised a process. They saw themselves as, they saw the situations as a way of influencing the ministry. So there was a lot of messages in our discussions with them that were basically to the ministry and not to us as organizers, and that was frustrating. So it's something about the role of the commissioning body and in this being hosting expert panels, which I think didn't work well. In my experience over more than 30 years, we have never had problems like that before. So it was very specific experience, a very special experience. What worked well was the information material. This was written by the ministry, which was not a really problem because the citizens then knew who Wusenda was, and they read it with those eyes. The expert panel and us as facilitators could comment on it and suggest changes. The ministry was very open to that. They basically took what we came with. So there was no real discussion about that. So I see it as a very balanced material, actually, and in a way I think it was good that it was the ministry. There's no discussion that this was a government, so this was, if there were any bias, it was a government position paper. the citizens could read it like that. I think in a way that was not the best way of making a balanced paper, but it was a good way of making a paper with transparency around, which I think is important. We made a planning group of 5 citizens who were by lottery chosen out of those who volunteered, together with one from the ministry and with me from the facilitators. And we discussed programs ahead of time. So what should we do with the next meetings? And we also evaluated together with this planning group the programs we had, which, for example, meant that during the first process, we were asked by the planning group to put in more panels. They would like to listen to more discussions between experts and less presentations. So we did that. So it was very good to give us feedback on the way we made the process, but also the way we made the program with evidence and experts. I can only recommend to do that. It was really good meetings, a good safe environment for everybody to say what they felt, and I think we succeeded in finding solution to anything that came up. That's my feeling. At least that was what the citizens said in the meeting. So I feel that was the situation. Malte mentioned counter expertise, and I would say yes, we really did that. But that's an old tradition in the Danish Board of Technology. Then when we can see a bias in paradigms, in interest or so, then we ensure that there are 2 experts, one from each side of those conflicts. So that's a principle we have always worked with, and we also did that here, and I think that works. And I think the experts accept it. They know that they are from different paradigms. They know that they have interest and so on. Even the stakeholders, of course, accept that. The 2 different rounds we made started differently. In the first, we started with overview presentations, and then we had thematic meetings afterwards, where we made deep dives. In the second, we started with just brainstorming without presentations by the citizens, and then we added experts to the questions that the citizens put up and they wanted to work with. The first one worked much better, and the citizens also said that. It was actually the citizens who said, well, those of the citizens who were took part in both rounds simply said that it worked better in the first round. So I think it was an experiment, and I think the lesson learned was start with presentations that gives a good overview of the complexity and the different areas, and then add at later meetings deep dives. I think that was a good way of doing it. We, just as in Austria, we had 10 to 20 minutes expert presentations, and that's an old tradition here at the Danish Board of Technology. We basically have the experience that this is enough, especially if you say to them, it's your messages that they want to listen to. It's not graphs, and it's not a scientific audience you have to convince about it, you have done everything right. This is about giving your messages. And they can do that in 10 to 20 minutes. They all of them worry about it, but in the end they can do it. So there's no reason to give them more time. What we did was we gave them an option to submit up to 2 pages afterwards, which were put on. We had a little portal or platform, closed platform for the citizens. And in that closed platform, we put up those 2 pages when they delivered. Very few of them did, and very few of them added information when we asked them after they have made that presentation. Oh, we have a little more time. Is there anything you didn't say in your presentation you want to add? And nearly all of them always said, no, I've said what I have to say. So I think 10 to 20 minutes is enough, and I think it provides an option of giving them a variety of input rather than fewer longer inputs. We also, as I said, added panel discussions with 4 to 6 experts and stakeholders. They would have 5 to 7 minutes to make a short presentation each, and then we would have the rest of 1 hour session where a discussion between them, and also questions or comments from the citizens. So basically an open discussion in the whole room. That worked very well, and I think the good thing about that is that the citizens get a better impression of when are these people talking about facts, when are they talking about opinions, and that comes out of a dialogue, not necessarily out of a presentation. So I think it makes a transparency in the biases and the different positions, and the citizens then can take a stand of those biases. All presentations were video recorded, and they were put on the public website afterwards. I think that transparency is necessary. We had no complaints about our miss of experts, but I think that is an option everybody should have, journalists or whoever it is, to see which programs we had, and also to see the presentations. And we did that. I think that's an easy thing to do nowadays. What we did was, for all the meetings we had and all the presentations afterwards, we gave the citizens about an hour in breakout groups, at least an hour in breakout groups, to brainstorm or sum up what they had heard over the presentations after each evidence session. I would really recommend that, because the good thing about it is that it's fresh in their memory. They might have taken some notes and so on, and those notes can be recorded, put into common documents, and then they are there so that they can work with them afterwards when they write up their report. So I think that worked very well. And I think it's necessary, because they are overloaded else with information. So it ends up being a brainstorm from their own heads later on, if you do not do it as just after the presentations. What we also did, and that's something we also did in our report, we asked them, when they made the sum up, to separate between observations, assessments, and recommendations they had heard. All of them are interesting in each of their way. Observation, because they can be a starting point for something that they want to work on with. Assessments, because they are kind of a situation description that they can use to discuss around and to develop recommendations, but also recommendations they heard, which they can take up as their own or not. Compared to what Ines said, we actually said to the experts, we would rather have that if you have recommendations, then present them to the citizens. That's your recommendations. And we do that for transparency. I would rather have the experts saying, and I recommend this and this, than hiding it between some kind of pseudo independence or scientific arguments or something. Like, rather be explicit if you have a position about what should happen, because then the citizens know what they listen to. I think that's a good way. And also, I think the recommendations the experts come with are actually not specifically biased. That's not the experience. Many of them try to come with what they think of as something that will work, something functional. So recommendations are not necessarily so biased as one can think. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lars. Thanks for that, those insights and that view under the hood, so to speak, of the Danish Climate Assembly knowledge work there. So basically, we have 10 minutes, 15 minutes or 10 minutes maybe for questions. I don't know if Ines is still here, but if you still have questions for Ines, you can also.
I can stay 10 minutes and 10.
Okay, excellent. I can see Jago. You have a question.
Thank you. I'm sorry not showing my screen, but I'm walking through the park right now. Thank you for your presentation. I think it was super interesting. Malte, your work is incredible. It's going to be really useful for us. And I'm especially interested in the counter-expert balance that Lars has been describing, because basically what we are proposing now for the Climate Horizon project that we are starting now is to directly build the knowledge group or the governance group with this counterbalance or counter-expert balance. And my question is, are you building this committee with counter-experts from the beginning, or you are just building ad hoc for a specific situation where you feel this counter-expertise is needed?
Good question, Jakob. I think when there are some situations while we are sitting there making the program and you think of inviting an expert, then it comes up in your head sometimes that if I invite this expert, then I have to invite that expert as well to get some balance here. Because you might know these experts and you might know that they come from a very specific approach to things. And then it might be good to have someone else who thinks otherwise as well. But I also think in practice, we also did it as a kind of repair exercise, because sometimes you invite experts and sometimes they are people you do not know so well. And then you begin to think, or someone comes up with a comment that this seems to be quite imbalanced. Seems to be more like a stakeholder expression than an expert presentation or something like that. And then you make corrective measures afterwards. And that's also why I think that this about making the overview presentations and then the deep dives later also give you an option of adding experts afterwards that can make this balance. But I also think that in some situations, the facilitator has an important role of making, if you hear these imbalances and you cannot do anything, it might be the last meeting you have or something like that. I mean, like a journalist would do, I think also as a moderator in the situation, you can also say that, you can also say to the person, this might be from a specific corner of the viewpoints in this area. What do you think about that yourself? Or, facilitate some kind of transparency, and also, ask the experts or the presenter to in a way, or make a disclaimer about his or her own position. And I think often they do it well when you ask them to do it. I don't know if that answered.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Ines, do you have a reaction to Jago's question, or do you want?
No, it's interesting for me to listen, as we did not have this counter expertise, and it makes totally sense to do it. And I just learned that this might make sense in the future when I'm part of an assembly again. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Mael, do you have a comment or question?
Yes, I have a question actually to you, Malte.
Yeah.
Greetings from France. Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Well, my question was on the point that you mentioned, that like natural scientists would be less contradicted by the participants, and less than the social scientists. And I think we can all imagine why. Is that like social sciences are much closer to what we think about every day. Like we basically do sociology every day, except not in the same manner as actual scientists. But anyway, thing is, like, did you actually try, or is there were there some experiments that tried to display the evidence in such an interactive way? Like, is there evidence that this is a better way to display the evidence, like for natural sciences? If my question is clear.
Yes, the question is clear. I mean, I don't think I've seen any. I haven't encountered any studies that kind of that sort of run an experiment. So the studies I've read are based on observations. So it's both from the kind of the science communication literature, but also from observations in certain mini publics. But I mean, I guess it's not a lot of, so these aren't a lot of studies. There are a few studies And I mean, I guess the thing about this is that it's also very dependent, I guess, on the individual scientists and how well you manage to brief them and facilitate their input in these things. And so I mean, the reason I include it in the briefing is because I think it's an intuitively meaningful point, I think, or observation that these studies make. And I think, as you say, it's kind of most people who've worked on these questions it kind of rings a bell in a way, or maybe can imagine why you might react in one way to a kind of a biologist or earth system scientist or something who offers like a kind of like a very factual account of something, as opposed to a sociologist who might be also more used to kind of presenting things in a way that's that leaves room for kind of space for disagreement and opposing views and so on. So the reason I included this is basically as a kind of word of caution that if you organize a climate assembly, this is something that I think you might have to think about. But of course, it depends on individual scientists and so on. But it's something at least to be mindful about, that citizens might react in a certain way to certain kinds of topics, and to have your eyes on whether that happens, and to kind of try and facilitate a more interactive format. But I can see, so Ines says that this difference, that you did not observe this difference in Austria.
Not at all.
It's good to hear, I guess.
Yeah, we had some scientists who were interdisciplinary by themselves. So a sociologist who is also a natural scientist, and there was one psychologist, environmental psychologist, who was a bit criticized by the men, because she was talking about lifestyles, personal attitudes, how to change my lifestyle towards a more sustainable one. And this was rather taken by the women and more opposed by the men. But this we also know that women, at least in Austria, but also other countries, contribute more to climate protection and less to climate change, and vice versa. So I'm not surprised about this.
That's a really good point. This is something I need to address in the briefing as well. Okay, so I think we don't have a lot of time for questions, so I think I'll just try and take the remaining questions all in one go now. So I think it was Laurie first, and then Marie afterwards.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Mata, a question for you. In your conclusion, you talked about the scientist position as honest broker was somewhat questionable, and you mentioned outmoded knowledge deficit, and I didn't quite understand where you were going with that.
Thanks. Marie, do you want to ask your question now?
Yes, please. And I see that someone in the chat essentially is posing the same question, so you get two for one. And that is that some experts can talk about the facts concerning the causes and effects of climate change, making the problem known, but then when we come to solutions, policy, it requires a very different kind of expertise. So I wondered about that, like the person in the chat, and I also wondered, you mentioned wicked issues. There is a lot of research on how to work to solve wicked issues, and has been for the past 40, 50 years. So if anyone has experience in how to include that kind of expertise in their assemblies. Also, we're tuning in from Norway, just forgot to mention.
Great, thanks so much. I'll just quickly react to those and then see if Lars wants to say something. Just on this last point, I think I think that's definitely true. What some people in this climate science literature argue is that even with brute facts in a way about climate change, that you have to be mindful not to kind of overwhelm people. And if you just present kind of the state of the world to them, then there's a risk that, I mean, there's the usual risk that goes with a kind of just a communication of knowledge format that lots of people who aren't used to that will not really be able to follow it, but also that it will kind of overwhelm people. And so that's one of the points, I mean, they make in the science communication literature, I think, is that in order not to be just overwhelmed by the sheer kind of depressing nature of what's going on, that even and I mean, I guess this is something you've thought about as well, that even the brute facts have to be kind of presented in a way that at least point to possible solutions somehow, or they need to be connected in a kind of forward-looking way. At least that's what I kind of got from quite a lot of the recent studies in kind of climate change communication literature. And then on the other point about the knowledge deficit model, I'm sorry I didn't explain that at all during my presentation. But so basically, so what that study argues is that there was a tendency in the mini public that they observed for scientists to basically, so that was basically the point about how experts would approach it as a kind of university lecture, a simple question of kind of transmitting knowledge from their own brains to the audience, and that, you know, and that the argument made is that such an approach is I mean basically the same risk as I just spoke about before, that it risks inspiring passivity amongst the or with the participants in the mini public or the assembly, rather than a kind of active response. So it risks kind of I mean basically not provoking or inspiring the kind of what can we do about this attitude. I think that's one of the main points of that literature that speaks about honest brokers and so on. There's a question about aspiring not to be a kind of a normative voice in there as well, of course, and fairness and giving different legitimate points of view and equal hearing and so on. Those points are in there, but there's also that points about always trying to see if you can make connections about knowledge to solutions, possible courses of action, and so on. I think that's an important point as well. But this is something I spend quite a lot of time on in the briefing, so you'll be able to kind of look into what if it's not clear now, when I circulate it later. But I hope that helps a bit. Lars, I don't know if you have a quick reaction. A very quick one, because I can see
a quick reaction to Stefan Krentz's and Marie's question about knowledge and facts about, I mean, the causes and effects of climate change and policies. I think it's, I understand the reason for the question, but I think in reality, there's not much difference between the two. I think I can just come with one example, which is if you look at agriculture and what should be done there, you have some technologies coming up. There's policy connected to these policies, and part of the whole discussion of coming up with those technologies, say for example, different technologies of avoiding methane coming out of manure. I mean, there's some technicalities around it, and how much does it mean for climate change? What can we do about it? Should we do this, or should we just do something else? The two are totally intertwined. We had very few presentations where I could say it was really about causes and effects. For example, we had one about tipping points, a presentation that was similar. What are tipping points, and what are the dynamics in these tipping points? That was one of the presentations where I would say it was really not political at all and not about policy. But else, I would say all presentations we had a policy element in them and had a fact discussion in them, and facts and policies both could be tested and discussed, I think, and were discussed. Take CCS, carbon capture and storage. You can come up with a lot of facts, but basically it's a matter of discussion of policy if you want to do that, and if you believe in that as a solution, or should do something else. So everything is intertwined in policy and with, as I see it. And I think that came out of all presentations, basically.
Thanks so much, Lars. So basically, I want to, so Deborah, I want to ask if I could maybe ask you to write your question in the chat, and then we can return to it when we come back from the breakout rooms, because I'd like to just give you a few minutes before we enter the breakout rooms, just a quick break where you can stretch your legs or make a cup of coffee or whatever. So basically, I'd say we take 5 minutes now, a 5-minute break, and then when we all return, you will all, or we will all, have been distributed into breakout rooms, where my hope is that we can continue the kind of experience sharing and reflection sharing exercise. And I encourage everyone to share their experiences and their reflections on best practices on knowledge curation in the breakout rooms, and everything you say will be taken into, we'll take notes, and I then will hope to integrate it into the briefing as well. But the plan is also, of course, to learn from each other. It's not just me. So 5 minutes, a 5-minute break, and then when we return, we'll do discussions in breakout rooms. Thank you. Is everyone back? It looks like it. So I hope you had some good discussions. So in order not to waste time, I basically just ask the facilitators of each of the breakout rooms to give a really quick and very kind of succinct recap of the discussions you had in the room. And I was in the room where Mark was a facilitator, so maybe I'll just ask Mark to begin, if that's okay.
Yes, I'd happily do that. I was mid-sentence as we left the room, but we had some really interesting discussions. And first of all, it's very clear that there's a need for this kind of guidance. So a lot of people are still new to these processes and trying to organize them. And it came up from different people that there really is a need to help support this process, because you can get lost in it. But not only that, but also mentioned as a point that there's a need for it also because the commissioners or the policymakers receiving this are always concerned about time and money. So there's really a need for making the case why it's important to invest in good evidence or good knowledge curation, because it takes time and it takes resources. So actually a big part of our conversation was about a particular kind of dilemma, which is that in these different types of assemblies, there's a risk sometimes, and the specific example came from Spain, presented by Iago, that there's a risk sometimes that you have commissioners that are biased, for example, organizations that are very strongly in favor of doing something about climate change, or even specific institutions within a governing body that has a strong opinion about certain aspects of this. So there's a risk that you actually delegitimize the neutrality of the citizens' assembly, because the people commissioning it have an idea of what kind of outcomes they want. And this kind of led to quite a big discussion, actually, that I think is almost too much to try to sum up. But it's just a really interesting question that might be relevant for us to get back to if we have time.
I completely agree. I also think we also discussed like basically I think there's an issue about how, as an organizer of a climate assembly, you position yourself in the political landscape. And I don't think so. The thing is, I think this question actually bears on knowledge curation. I think so. An example of this might be the French climate assembly, because of the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, and the kind of fraught political climate around these issues in French at the time. I think it looks like, at least, that there was a relationship between the skepticism amongst a lot of French citizens towards the kind of political elites and so on, and how knowledge curation or evidence work was approached within the assembly. And I don't think this is anything you can really produce guidance on in any meaningful sense, because it really is a question of how do you position yourself in the political landscape. But I think it's something that I include in a kind of discussion section in the briefing. And I think it's something where basically it's just really important to think about how if there are certain pressures from external pressures on the assembly, how they impact or bear both on the legitimacy, which is, I guess, like a paramount issue, but also on how you approach the question of knowledge and the relationships that might be between those issues. Thanks, but that I just jumped in with that comment. Maybe I can ask Stine to recap from their discussion in her group.
Yes, thank you, Malte. I will do it very short. We had different issues in our discussion, but mainly we were talking about what is the purpose with the evidence in the climate assemblies. Is it to for the citizens to understand the issues, or do we have some kind of understanding that we need to change their opinions? So that's two conflicting ways to think of evidence. And then we had a lot of discussion about that, and if it makes any sense to kind of map change of opinions. And then we also discussed trade-offs from the evidence and how to make it visible. If there are any stakeholders that have any specific trade-off possibilities, and then if it's possible to have an overview of the main topics, or if it's not possible, and in a sense of value. So yeah, so we talked about value-based trade-offs as well. This is a very short summarize, but maybe some of the group members can comment or support if I left important issues out.
No, that's perfect, Stine. I won't react to it because I already spoke for too long. So I'll just pass the ball on to Morten and hear if you want to give us a quick recap, and then we just have 5 or 6 minutes for like a last round of reactions if anyone wants to say anything. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. So in our breakout room, we categorized the discussion around 3 sections. So the first one is the selection of experts or knowledge in the process, and then how they presented it afterwards, and then their role, the experts' role within and during and after the assemblies. And regarding the selection, we had discussed a little bit about what you should call experts. Pete had a point that they actually didn't call them experts; they call it commentators. And how you present not only the knowledge but also the persons presenting the knowledge has implications on the further discussions. So as a minimum, you should be transparent regarding what and how you present those experts. And then regarding the presentation, there was a point made that maybe communication skills should be a requirement for the selection of who should be allowed to present their information, because it has so big importance. And that the language you use are also implementing have an impact on that as well. And then the role during and after we also discussed regarding that. Yeah, I think in very short, that was what we came around.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Morten. And thanks to Mark, Stine, and Morten in general for chairing the breakout rooms, or facilitating the discussions there. Now I just want to open the floor for 5 minutes for like a final round of reactions. If anyone wants to raise any issue or comment or elaborate on something from the discussions in the breakout rooms. Yes, Deborah, yeah, I didn't give the word to you the last time, so you definitely are the first one to have it now.
That's very kind of you, thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to point out the importance of redressing the imbalance of the topic of overpopulation in most climate assemblies that I've seen, including the Global Assembly. because for historical reasons, the UN didn't adopt a global population policy. This was due to pressure from the Catholic Church, and consequently, scientists like Bill Rees have been excluded from debate. And because overpopulation is such an important overarching driver of climate change, I mean, every child will be responsible in the course of its lifetime at present for something like, I think, yeah, it's a huge amount. It's something like 53 billion or something. I can't remember, but in any case, in comparison to many other means of reducing emissions, every child that we can, reduce the population by will have an enormous effect on climate change. So I'd just like to point out that there is great reluctance on the part of the UN and associated scientists from addressing this. And as independent organizers of climate assemblies, we should work on redressing that balance because it is such an important overarching factor. That's just all I'd like to point out. I've put a link in the chat on that.
Thanks so much for that comment, Deborah, and that observation. So does anyone else have any final reactions or something they want to elaborate from the discussions? Stephen doesn't agree. Yeah, but I agree that's probably a discussion for a different time. Degrowth. I mean, I guess this speaks to so Percy asks who decides whether or not degrowth is considered a topic in climate assemblies. And I guess this precisely speaks to that. I guess this was a point that Pauline made in our breakout room, that counter expertise has to be thought of in a very broad way, actually, or even beyond counter expertise in climate assemblies, because we need to be able to ask fundamental questions about sort of ruling paradigms and basic presuppositions of the way we live and so on. So counter expertise might not even be enough. I guess I think this is a good point as well. Lars, you want to come in and say something?
We had a heated discussion in the Danish second round about degrowth and the whole concept of growth. And I think, in a way, I think it should be a climate assembly in itself. It was really, really, really difficult for people to discuss, and also because there were all the usual positions that there are people in this world who need growth. There are even people in our own societies who need growth. It was really, really difficult. And I think it ended up with the citizens simply saying to each other, let's just say that we have to we need to take away those parts of the growth that really is harmful. So they ended up with a compromise, the only way they could land that discussion. So I think this is really worth assemblies in itself as a question. It's really difficult to take up as a part of a climate assembly. It's really difficult.
Thank you, Lars. So I want to give Marie just 1 minute now. It has to be very brief. I'm sorry for a final reaction. Before then, giving the final word to Graham, who just wants to say something about the upcoming events. But Marie, just a very quick reaction.
So I think what this exemplifies is when you ask a very broad question in terms of climate, like how do we reach the climate goals or the 2030 agenda, then you get these like massive differences in approach. And if you focus down on a smaller issue, say carbon capture or something that is still very complex and maybe even controversial, but it's then easier to curate knowledge that really can reach across all kinds of paradigms and also lets the citizens make recommendations that are actually useful instead of maybe so general that they're not useful for politicians or others who need to implement them.
Thanks, Marie, and thanks so much to everyone for all this great input. I'll take it into account and bring it along in the subsequent work on the briefing, and Graham will so as well on the development of the guidance that we'll work on afterwards. So thank you, everyone, and Graham, I'll give the last word to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's been a really, really productive couple of hours, and what it's made clear to me is how important it is that we do make some sort of interventions as a knowledge network in this area. And there's a real challenge for us is about, you know, trying to get it right compared to kind of doing the best we can given the kinds of pressures and resources that most practitioners and organizers are working under. So I think trying to get the guidance right here is important. I just want to say a couple of thanks to a couple of people before I just mention a couple of events that are coming up, further events. First, actually, someone who's in the audience, Stephanie Brancaforte from Rinascimento Green, who actually did a little bit of work on this for us about a year ago, and which Mulder is building on that. So thank you, Stephanie, for that early work that you did. And thank you, Mulder, as I said, for taking us through this. And he will share a draft with everybody who was at this workshop in order that you can give some critical feedback on what he's doing. Just to let you know about a few things we've got in the pipeline. At the end of the month, on the 30th of March, we've got Alina is presenting an NGO playbook, and this is really to respond to the demand from climate NGOs to think about how they can engage with climate assemblies. They've had a very ambiguous relationship with climate assemblies, and she's put together a playbook explaining the different parts of assemblies and the different ways that NGOs could engage at the start, during an assembly, and afterwards. And I think it's going to be a really interesting event. I hope, and I see Maria's on the call today, and I apologize for not having firmed this up, but I hope that we're going to have a learning call about the Polish Assembly in April, which will both look at the issue of how they dealt with, of how they organized the assembly, but also running an assembly in a deeply divided, politically divided society. So there'll be some really interesting debates around that. We've also agreed today with Pete from Shared Future, who's on the call, to run a workshop around the support that we should give to assembly members after the assembly is finished. What role for assembly members once the assembly is finished? And also in late May, and this responds to some of this stuff around degrowth and some of the stuff around systems change, is that actually we're launching a report which is being produced by CAST on how climate assemblies could be used to think about systems change. Very often they're focused much more on practical policy recommendations, but can they be used and what would it mean for an assembly to focus on systems change? So once again, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to spend time with the Knoca community. I think this is clearly an issue we need to do more work on. I'd like to thank DBT, everyone at DBT, Stina and Nana and Mark for hosting this. And I really look forward to seeing how Mulder actually integrates all the things that have been said today into his briefing. But once again, thanks to everybody, and look forward to seeing you at the next workshop. Take care, everybody.